If someone had told me a year ago that the loudest, most disruptive man I had ever met would become the quiet center of my world, I would have laughed. A dry, papery laugh, the kind that suited a man who spent his days cataloging the dead. But here we are. It started, as most of my life's significant events did, with an intrusion. My world was a carefully constructed fortress of silence. It was built from the hushed reverence of the archives, the scent of aging paper and binding glue, the predictable click of my keyboard, and the echoing quiet of the library's lower level. I was Leo, the keeper of stories, a ghost in my own life, content to live between the lines of other people's histories. My routine was a religion. Earl Grey tea at 8. A systematic review of new acquisitions until 10. The delicate, meditative work of preservation until lunch, which I ate alone at my desk. It was a small kingdom, but it was mine. Then came Julian. He was a force of nature, a hurricane in work boots. He and his crew were contracted for the library's grand restoration project, a necessary evil I had been dreading for months. From my basement sanctuary, I heard him before I ever saw him. The percussive slam of a truck door, a laugh that boomed through the century-old floorboards, the aggressive shriek of a power saw that set my teeth on edge. He was noise. He was chaos. He was everything my life was structured to keep out. From a distance, he was an archetype, broad shoulders straining the fabric of a dusty t-shirt. A confident, almost arrogant stride. He moved through the world as if he owned it, as if the space around him naturally bent to his will. I watched him from the high, arched windows of the reading room, a secret, resentful observer. I saw the way the younger librarians would flush when he'd offer a lazy, sawdust-flecked smile. He was a cliché, a walking romance novel cover, and I loathed him for it. Or I told myself I did. The truth was, he was compelling. A sun in a universe of muted lamps. His physical presence was an undeniable fact, a gravitational pull I felt even 2 floors away. I resented the disruption, but more than that, I resented the way my eyes would snag on the line of his back as he lifted a heavy plank of wood, the way I found myself cataloging the shifting map of dust and sweat on his skin instead of the dewy decimal classifications I was supposed to be reviewing. He was a man of action, of tangible things, while I was a man of theory and ghosts. The distance between our worlds felt less like a gap and more like a chasm. Professionally, he was the builder, and I was the curator. Socially, he was the sun, and I was the subterranean creature that flinched from the light. For weeks, this was our dynamic. Unspoken, he was the noise upstairs, and I was the quiet below. We exchanged, at most, a clipped nod if we passed in the hallway. His eyes, a startling shade of blue I could see even under a layer of grime, would sweep over me without a flicker of recognition. I was just another fixture of the old building, as inanimate as a card catalog or a dusty globe. And I preferred it that way. It was safer to be unseen, safer to observe from the shadows of my quiet, ordered life. The chasm between us was a comfort, a wall I had no intention of ever crossing. The disruption of my routine, when it finally came, was not a shout but a whisper, a slow, insidious drip. It started on a Tuesday, a day that was supposed to be dedicated to the brittle pages of 18th century ledgers. A frantic call came from the main floor. A pipe, old and forgotten behind a wall in the east wing, had burst. Water was pouring into the Thornton reading room, directly above the most fragile section of my archives. My carefully constructed piece shattered. The next few hours were a blur of control panic. We moved the most vulnerable collections, a frantic ballet of carts and archival boxes. And in the middle of it all, there was Julian. He was no longer just ambient noise. He was the center of the storm, directing his crew, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the chaos. He was calm. He was competent. It was infuriating. By nightfall, the immediate danger was contained, but the damage was done. The East Wing was a disaster zone of peeled plaster and warped floorboards. And my archives, my quiet sanctuary, were now command central. Julian informed me, not asked, that he and a small team would have to work around the clock. The structural integrity was compromised. my presence, as the one person who knew the value and fragility of every item, was non-negotiable force proximity. The two most terrifying words in my vocabulary. Suddenly, my fortress had been breached. The chasm had closed, and he was on my side of the wall. My quiet, solitary nights were to be filled with the clang of tools, the smell of damp plaster, and him. Julian. He set up a small command post near my desk. A folding table littered with blueprints, thermoses, and the organized chaos of his trade. My world of paper and silence was now a construction site. The air, usually thick with the scent of vanilla and old leather, now smelled of sawdust and sweat and something else, something uniquely him. It was a clean, sharp scent, like freshly cut cedar and soap. I tried to maintain my distance, retreating into my work, pretending the constant thrum of activity was nothing more than background noise. But it was impossible. He was a supernova in my tiny, quiet cosmos. I found myself watching him from the corner of my eye. This was when I began to see him not as an archetype, but as a man. I started noticing the details. A small, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The way he'd chew on the inside of his cheek when studying a particularly complex blueprint. The surprising dexterity of his hands, which I had only ever seen gripping a hammer or a saw, as they carefully sketched a revised support plan onto a piece of paper. His hands were large, calloused, and flecked with paint, but they moved with an artist's precision. One night, late, the library was a cavern of shadows and echoes. Only the task lights in the archive were on, casting long, dancing specters on the towering shelves. His crew had gone home for a few hours of sleep, but Julian remained. He was slumped in a chair, head in his hands, the picture of exhaustion. The confident, arrogant facade I had projected onto him was gone. In its place was a weary man, shouldering a heavy burden. For the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability. He looked up, and his gaze met mine across the room. There was no lazy smile, no bravado, just a tired, raw honesty. "Long night," he said, his voice raspy. "They always are," I replied, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate in my mouth. He offered a small, ghost of a smile. "You hate this, don't you? Us being in your space." It was a direct hit. I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. "It is an adjustment. That's a polite way of saying it," he grunted, rubbing his eyes. "Don't worry, librarian. We'll get her quiet back for you." He called me librarian, not with derision, but with a kind of gentle teasing. A name, a designation. It was the first time he had truly acknowledged me as a person. The thaw began there, in the shared exhaustion of that long night. The next day, the chill between us had lessened, replaced by a tentative, unspoken truce. He started asking me questions, not just about the archives, but about the books themselves. What was the oldest thing in here? What was my favorite? I would answer, my voice stiff with disuse at first, then slowly relaxing as I talked about my passion. He would listen, his head cocked to the side, his blue eyes focused and genuinely curious. He wasn't just being polite. He was interested. Then came the touch. It was nothing. It was everything. He was on a tall, rolling ladder, examining a section of damaged ceiling. I was below, holding a flashlight for him, my neck craned at an uncomfortable angle. He shifted his weight, and for a heart-stopping second, the ladder wobbled precariously. My reaction was pure instinct. I lunged forward, my hands finding the cold metal of the ladder to steady it. In the same motion, his hand shot out to brace himself against the bookshelf beside him, and the back of his hand brushed against mine. A jolt, a static shock that arced up my arm and detonated somewhere in my chest. My heart, a frantic trapped bird, beat a panicked rhythm against my ribs. The point of contact, a fleeting, accidental brush of skin on skin, burned like a brand. His skin was warm, slightly rough. Real. I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove. "Whoa, thanks," he said, his voice a little breathless. He had regained his balance. Close one, I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my throat tight. My entire being was focused on the tingling ghost of his touch on my hand. I am overreacting. This is insane. He's a man on a ladder. You are a man holding a flashlight. Get a grip. My internal monologue was a frantic, useless scramble. He climbed down, his boots thudding softly on the concrete floor. He stood in front of me, closer than he had ever been before. I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the flecks of gold in the blue. He was looking at my hand, the one I had pulled away so quickly. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. "You look like you've seen a ghost. I work in an archive. I managed, aiming for wit and landing somewhere near strangled panic. I see them all the time." He didn't laugh. He just held my gaze for a moment too long, an unreadable expression on his face. The air between us was thick, charged with something new and terrifying. The dynamic had shifted again. The accidental touch had created a bridge across the chasm, and I didn't know whether to cross it or set it on fire. The true shift in power, however, came a few days later. A new leak had appeared, this one smaller but more sinister, dripping directly onto a glass case containing the library's founding charter. A priceless, impossibly fragile document from 1794. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. The case was locked, and the curator with the key was out of town until the next day. Julian saw the look on my face and was at my side in an instant. "What's wrong?" I pointed, my hand trembling. "That charter cannot get wet. It will dissolve into pulp." His eyes followed my finger. He assessed the situation with a professional calm that I, in my academic terror, could not muster. He saw the drip, the heavy glass, the antique, complex lock. I was frozen, useless, a scholar watching his life's work about to be destroyed. He, the man of action, was already moving, but he stopped. He turned to me. "Okay, Leo," he said, using my name for the first time. It sounded strange and solid in his mouth. "You're the expert here. What's a protocol? How do we move it without damaging it? You tell me what to do, and I'll make it happen." In that moment, everything changed. He, the big, confident contractor, was deferring to me. He was placing his capability in my hands, waiting for my instruction. The confident facade was still there, but it was now in service of my knowledge. I was no longer the quiet man in the basement. I was the one in charge. I found my voice. I explained the precise way the document had to be handled, the exact angle it needed to be kept at, the atmospheric conditions it required. He listened intently, nodding. Then, with a delicate touch I would never have believed possible, he used a thin piece of metal to jimmy the old lock, his large hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. He opened the case, and together, with him taking my quiet, careful direction, we lifted the fragile parchment and moved it to safety. We stood there afterward, side by side, looking at the saved document. My heart was still hammering, but the panic had been replaced by a thrum of adrenaline and something else. A connection. We had done this together. "See," he said, a genuine, warm smile spreading across his face. "We make a good team. You and I a good team." The words echoed in the quiet of the archive, sinking into me. The man who had been a disruption, a source of anxiety, was now my partner. The field between us had been leveled, and standing on that new, equal ground, I was more terrified than ever, because the wall I had so carefully built around my heart was beginning to crumble, brick by dusty brick. The storm that finally broke everything open was literal. It rolled in on a Thursday evening, a bruised purple monster that swallowed the sky. The weather reports had warned of a severe one, but no one had predicted its ferocity. The wind howled like a hungry animal, rattling the tall, arched windows of the library until it seemed the very glass would shatter. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. We were the only two left in the building. The rest of his crew had wisely gone home hours ago. I had stayed, ostensibly to finish cataloging a new collection, but in truth, the thought of returning to my empty apartment held less appeal than the thrumming, charged atmosphere of the archives with him in it. Then, with a deafening crack of thunder that shook the building to its foundations, the power went out. We were plunged into absolute, primordial darkness, the kind of black that felt heavy, a physical weight on my eyelids. My breath caught in my throat. I am not afraid of the dark. I'm not. But my heart was a frantic drum. "Lao!" Julian's voice came from across the room, steady and calm, a lighthouse in the sudden void. "You still there?" "I haven't been raptured, if that's what you're asking," I said, my attempt at humor sounding thin and shaky. I heard a soft rustle, then the click and bright, narrow beam of a flashlight. It swept across the shelves, momentarily blinding me before settling on my face. I flinched. He was closer than I thought. He walked toward me, his boots making soft sounds on the floor. He was holding a second, smaller flashlight. "Here," he said, pressing it into my hand. Our fingers brushed. This time, the contact was expected, but the jolt was no less potent. It was a live wire, and I felt the current all the way to my toes. I took the light, my hand clumsy. We were trapped. The storm was raging with a fury that made leaving impossible. The backup generators for the security system had kicked in, but the main power grid was dead. We were in our own little world, an island of dusty books and flickering flashlight beams, surrounded by the storm's symphony of chaos. We ended up in the special collections room, the most secure and windowless part of the archives, just to be safe from the rattling glass. We sat on the floor, our backs against a row of metal shelves, our flashlight beams making dancing patterns on the ceiling. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and the ozone tang of the storm. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was full, expectant. He broke it first. "You know," he said, his voice a low murmur that barely rose above the drumming of the rain. "When I took this job, I figured it'd be just another old building. Plaster and dust. Headaches," he paused, turning his flashlight in his hands. "I didn't expect this, the biblical flood?" I asked. He chuckled, a soft, warm sound in the dark. "No. Well, yes. But I meant this place. The stories. The things you've shown me." He looked over at me, his face half lit, his eyes deep pools of shadow. My breath hitched. My name. From him. It was a confession, quiet and profound. "You're not what I expected either, Leo," he continued, his voice softer still. "I see the way you look at these books like they're alive, like you're their guardian. I thought you were just some stuffy academic who hated the noise. But you're passionate. You just keep it hidden." My carefully constructed walls were turning to mist. He saw me. He actually saw me. Not the quiet librarian, not the ghost in the archives. Me. And in the strange, confessional intimacy of the dark, with a world raging outside, the truth spilled out of me before I could stop it. "You terrify me, Julian," he stilled. The flashlight beam in his hand stopped its lazy dance. "I what? You're so present," I struggled to explain, the words feeling like foreign objects in my mouth. "You take up space. You make noise. You live so loudly. And my entire life has been an exercise in being quiet, in not being noticed. And you came in, and I noticed. I could not notice you. It's been the most disruptive thing that's ever happened to me." The confession hung in the air between us, fragile and terrifying. I had said too much. I had cracked open my chest and shown him the frantic, foolish thing that lived inside. I wanted to snatch the words back, to pack them away in an archival box and lock it forever. He didn't speak for a long moment. The only sounds were the storm and my own ragged breathing. Then he shifted, turning to face me more fully. He reached out and placed his hand on my knee. It wasn't a fleeting brush this time. It was a deliberate, solid, grounding weight. My entire body went rigid. "Is that a bad thing?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Being noticed by you?" I couldn't answer. I could only look at him, at the earnest, searching expression on his face, illuminated in the pale glow of our lights. He saw the answer in my eyes. He started to lean in, slow, hesitant. It was a question, not a demand. His gaze dropped to my lips, then back to my eyes, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to say no, to retreat back in my fortress of silence. I didn't. The first kiss was not a collision. It was a discovery. His lips were softer than I could have imagined, and they tasted faintly of coffee and something else, something uniquely Julian. It was slow, questioning, gentle exploration in the dark. His hand moved from my knee to my jaw, his callous thumb stroking my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I brought my hand up to his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was just as frantic as my own. In that kiss, years of solitude melted away. The longing I had so carefully suppressed, the desire I had told myself I didn't feel, it all rose to the surface, not in a torrent, but in a quiet, powerful tide. It was a kiss that said, "I see you. I am here." It was the most honest conversation I had ever had. When we finally pulled apart, we just breathed into shared darkness. The storm still raged outside, but inside, in our small, protected world, a profound quiet had fallen. A quiet that wasn't empty, but full of a new, terrifying, and beautiful possibility. I woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight on my face. It was streaming through the tall, grimy windows of the archives, painting stripes of gold across the floor. The storm had passed. The silence that remained was absolute, a deep, humming quiet that was a stark contrast to the emotional cataclysm of the night before. I was alone. I sat up, my back aching from sleeping slumped against a bookshelf. A rough wool blanket, one Julian must have kept in his truck, was draped over me. But he was gone. His tools were packed neatly by the door. His folding table was cleared, save for a single, empty coffee thermos. The air no longer smelled of him, of cedar and soap. It just smelled like dust. A cold dread, heavy and metallic, began to pool in my stomach. It was a mistake. Of course, it was a mistake. A strange, heady cocktail of proximity, danger, and darkness. An anomaly. The sun was up, the world was back to normal, and he had fled from the strangeness of what we had done. My mind, my greatest asset and my cruelest torturer, began to spin a vicious narrative. I had misread everything. I had taken his kindness, his exhaustion, and twisted it into something it wasn't. I had been a fool, a lonely, pathetic man who had projected his own desperate longing onto the first person to show him a flicker of attention. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from my chest to my face. I stood up on shaky legs and walked through the silent library. The morning light felt accusatory. Everything looked the same, but was irrevocably different. The spot on the floor where we had sat, where he had kissed me, seemed to burn with a cold fire. He had left a note, a single folded piece of paper tucked under the thermos. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for it, my hand trembling so badly I could barely unfold it. How to get supplies. Back later. That was it. No emotion. No acknowledgement of the night before. Just the brisk, professional words of a contractor. Back later. It was a dismissal, a return to the status quo. The chasm had been crossed for one night, and now he was retreating to his side, rebuilding the wall between us with every impersonal word. My stomach twisted itself into a tighter, colder knot. The anxiety was a swarm of bees, buzzing frantically inside me, telling me to run, to hide, to pretend it never happened. He didn't come back later. He sent one of his younger crew members, a kid named Marco, to oversee the day's work. Marco was polite enough, but he was not Julian. The day dragged on, each hour a fresh torment. Every time the door to the archives opened, my head would snap up, my heart leaping with a stupid, desperate hope, only to see it wasn't him. I tried to work, but the words on the pages blurred. My fortress of silence had returned, but it was no longer a comfort. It was a prison. It was haunted by his absence. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was empty. It was the sound of being left behind. The next day was the same, and the day after that. 3 days of agonizing, deafening silence. He didn't call. He didn't text. He simply vanished from my world as suddenly as he had entered it. The narrative in my head grew darker, more certain. He regretted it. He was disgusted. Or worse, he was laughing about it with his crew, the story of the weird, quiet librarian who had thrown himself at him in the dark. Each possibility was a fresh turn of the knife. I retreated further into myself. I became the ghost in the archives once more, but this time I was rattling my own chains. The solitude that had once been my shield now felt like a punishment. I had tasted connection, real, tangible connection, and now its absence was a constant, aching pain. I had let the chaos in, and when it had receded, it had taken a part of me with it, leaving a hollow space I didn't know how to fill. I had been brave for a single night, and my reward was this crushing, absolute silence. On the third night, I was preparing to leave, to go back to my quiet apartment that now felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. I couldn't bear to be in the library another minute. The place was a monument to my own foolishness. I was packing my bag when the door to the archives creaked open. I didn't even look up. "Marco, we're locking up for the night." It's not Marco, the voice. His voice. It was low and rough, and it hit me like a physical blow. I froze, my hand hovering over my bag. Slowly, I lifted my head. Julian was standing there, framed in the doorway. He looked terrible. He was unshaven. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and he wore the same dusty clothes he'd had on 3 days ago. He wasn't the confident, swaggering man from before. He looked lost. He looked wrecked. He looked exactly how I felt. He took a hesitant step into the room, then another. He didn't come any closer. We stood on opposite sides of the room, the space between us charged with 3 days of unspoken fear and doubt. "I'm sorry," he said, the words sounding like they were scraped from his soul. "Leo," I ran. I just stared at him, my heart a painful, stuttering drum. "I woke up that morning," he continued, his gaze fixed on the floor, "and the sun was out, and everything was real, and it scared the hell out of me. What happened between us, it wasn't. I'm not good at that. At feelings. I build things. I fix things. I don't do that." He finally looked up, and his blue eyes were filled with a raw vulnerability that stole the breath from my lungs. So I did what I always do. I went to work. I tried to bury it in noise and dust, but it didn't work. This place, he gestured vaguely around the archives, was quieter than my job site. The silence was, God, it was so loud. He took another step closer. These last 3 days have been the longest of my life. I kept playing it over and over in my head. I kept thinking I messed it all up, that I scared you, that you regretted it. All the air rushed out of my lungs. The vicious narrative I had spun, the self-recrimination, the shame, he had been feeling it too. He hadn't been laughing. He had been terrified, just like me. "I thought you regretted it," I whispered, the words barely audible. "I thought it was a mistake. An anomaly, a mistake." He let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "Leo, that was the realest thing that's happened to me in years. That's what scared me." He closed the distance between us then, crossing the room in 3 long strides until he was standing right in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, not to touch me, but just held his hand suspended in the air between us, as if asking for permission. "I don't want to be quiet anymore," I said, the confession of final surrender. "I don't want to be alone." "Good," he breathed, a universe of relief in that single word. "Because I'm tired of the noise." And then he finally touched me, his hand coming to rest on the side of my neck, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. It wasn't a spark this time. It was a current, a deep, steady flow of reassurance that calmed the frantic buzzing in my soul. He leaned his forehead against mine, and we just stood there in the quiet of the archives, 2 terrified men choosing to be brave together. We talked for hours, a real conversation, honest and raw, laying our fears bare on the dusty floor between us. I told him about my life of quiet observation, my fear of being too much and not enough all at once. He told me about his loneliness, a life surrounded by loud crews and busy sights, but feeling utterly isolated, a man valued for his hands, but rarely for his heart. We acknowledged that this new territory was frightening, uncharted, but that the thought of returning to the way things were before was infinitely more terrifying. The renovations finished a week later. The library was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, a peaceful one. On his last day, Julian found me in my usual spot. He was holding something in his hands. It was a small, rectangular box, crafted from a piece of dark, reclaimed oak from the library's own damaged floorboards. It was sanded so smooth it felt like silk, the grain of the wood a beautiful, swirling map. "For you," he said, pressing it into my hands. It was warm from his touch. I opened it. Nestled on a bed of black velvet was a single, old-fashioned brass key. I looked at him, confused. "It's to my apartment," he said, a small, shy smile playing on his lips. "The lock is a bit tricky, You have to jiggle it just right. He met my eyes, his gaze steady and clear. It's just in case. You know, for when you feel like disrupting my quiet, it was more than a key. It was a promise. It was an invitation. It was a tangible symbol of a wall coming down, a door being opened. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. That was 6 months ago. My life is no longer a fortress of silence. It's a shared space. It's the sound of Julian's booming laugh in the kitchen as he tries to follow one of my complicated recipes. It's the soft thud of his boots by the door next to my worn leather shoes. It's the smell of coffee and sawdust in the morning, a scent I once found intrusive, that is now the smell of home. We make coffee together in his sunny kitchen. My books have begun a slow, steady colonization of his shelves, nestling themselves between carpentry manuals and stacks of blueprints. Some nights, we read in bed, his solid warmth a comforting weight beside me, the only sound the soft rustle of turning pages. The quiet is no longer an absence. It's a presence. It's a shared peace that is deeper and more profound than the solitude I once cherished. I look back at the man I was, the ghost in the archives, and I barely recognize him. I thought my life was perfectly ordered, meticulously curated. But it wasn't ordered. It was empty. It was a story with no plot. Julian wasn't just a disruption. He was the inciting incident. He was the storm that broke down the walls and let the light in, showing me a world I was too afraid to live in. He was the plot twist I never saw coming. I came to the library looking for stories, content to live in the past, in the lives of others. I never imagined my own story was about to begin. I thought it would be just a fling, a momentary lapse in my carefully controlled existence. But he became the love of my life. He is the loudest, most wonderful, most beautifully disruptive man I have ever known, and in the quiet moments when his head is resting on my chest, his breathing a soft, steady rhythm against my own, I know I have finally found my peace. Not in the silence of solitude, but in the shared, beautiful noise of us. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of us build walls to keep the world out, without realizing we're also locking ourselves in? Have you ever had someone come into your life and completely upend your world for the better? Let me know your own stories in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more so we can explore these feelings together.